Hi, welcome to Visual Hop. This is Al, and we're going to be looking at the Securities Exchange Act of 1933 in one video. We're going to set the scene in a park. For me, the number 33 kind of sounds like the word tree or tree. So we're going to place two trees here at the top of the hill to remind us of 1933. The leaves on the tree are going to be made out of leaves of paper, and we're also going to have an image of Honest Abe Lincoln here. This is so that you remember that the Securities Exchange Act of 1933 is also known as the Paper Act and the Truth in Securities Act. The roots of the trees are making this sort of protective gesture to remind you that the Securities Exchange Act of 1933 was designed to protect investors by creating transparency and by prohibiting deceit. These two trees are also going to be placed at the beginning of Wall Street. This should remind you that the Securities Exchange Act of 1933 is when the federal government started to regulate Wall Street and the issuance of securities. The protective roots of the two trees are wrapping over this whole area. So remember that anything that is under the roots is covered by the Securities Exchange Act of 1933. Under the roots, we're going to be looking at the three phases of an underwriting. The first thing we're going to see under the roots is a brand new box of tissues. It's shiny and new, and it has a big tag that says new. This new box of tissues is being placed inside of a registrar. This is because new issues must register with the SEC under the Securities Exchange Act of 1933. The box of tissues is also holding on to a red piece of steak. It's really strange, I know. Red steak sort of sounds like reg state, so this reminds me of registration statement. We're going to be looking at registration statements in other lessons, and we're always going to use a red steak to signify a registration statement. Now this is going to sound really odd, but the red steak also has two little hands, and these are proudly holding up two magazines, one with the dollar signs like the Wall Street Journal, while the other hand is holding up a non-financial magazine. This could be People or Architectural Digest. This should remind you that registration statements contain financial and non-financial information on an offering. To the right of the new box of tissues registering with the SEC, it looks like it's snowing in this part of the park. There's some snowflakes here, and these snowflakes are going to represent the cooling off period that occurs after a registration statement is filed. Now, there are 4 snowflakes, and each snowflake has 5 points. That's not by coincidence. It's so you remember that in total, the cooling off period is for a minimum of 20 days. Each snowflake represents 5 days, and there are 4 of them, so that adds up to 20 days. Under this little snowstorm you see, we're going to have this fish, and it's painted red, and you probably guessed it. It's going to be the image for the red herring prospectus. The red herring is also pointing or indicating to this interest symbol. That should remind you that a red herring is used to get indications of interest. Remember also that a red herring prospectus is the same thing as a preliminary prospectus. They call it a red herring prospectus in reference to the front page disclaimer stating in bold red that the information contained is not complete and may change, and that the securities may not be sold. That's why we have this big equal sign between the red herring and this really smart looking cat that has a pair of spectacles on. The cat is purring and he has spectacles on, so he's going to be our image for the preliminary prospectus. Let's also remember that during the cooling off period, a registered representative may only accept indications of interest for a security and may only send out the preliminary prospectus. That's why the preliminary... Okay, I'm going to stop now with the purring. My cat is looking at me weird. Another image we have placed under the cooling off period is this tombstone. Now, real tombstones only have very limited information, like when a person died and their name and such. And financial tombstones advertisements are no different. You will only find basic information on a tombstone ad, like the name of the issuer, the date, the offering price, the number of shares, and information on the underwriter. Let me also say that tombstone advertisements are not mandatory, and they are not an offer for sale. They're just a notification of a sale that's going to take place. Make the connection that just like real tombstones are not an offering of anything, tombstone advertisements are not an offer for sale. Below the tombstone, we have an image of a zombie-looking financial advisor with his hand out, kind of like he's asking for money. This zombie advisor is here to remind you that soliciting money from clients during the cooling off period is not permitted. If your boss finds out, you might die, like this guy. Once we move past the cooling off period, we can see a pair of large spectacles, and they're placed to the right of the cooling off period, so we know this occurs after the cooling off period. These spectacles have a big price tag on them with dollar signs, and they also have a calendar dates on the lenses. This is so that you remember that the prospectus has price and date information, which is not included in the preliminary prospectus, aka the red herring. The prospectus occurs during the third phase of an underwriting, and here is our final image under the roots. During this phase, advisors are now allowed to solicit money from clients, hence the image. Now we're going to be moving outside the roots of the two trees, or outside the scope of the Securities Exchange Act of 1933. And we're going to cross the street over here, where we're going to have some new images. These new images are not covered by the SEC Act of 1933. In fact, they're exempt from the SEC Act of 1933. That's why they're not placed under the roots. For me, the word exempt makes me think of the letter X, and I immediately think of the X-Men. So because I love the X-Men, we're going to use an X-Men flag on top of this federal building, and we're also going to place it on top of the Empire State Building and on top of this municipal town clock building. And this is going to signify that federal, state, and municipal levels of government are all exempt from registration under the Securities Exchange Act of 1933. There's also a small church drawn here so that you can remember that non-profit organizations are also exempt from registration. To the right of the church, we have an image of a piggy bank. Oink, oink. And for me, a piggy bank is just a way to remember a bank. We're going to use piggy banks in other lessons, and they're always going to signify banks. Some people might not like piggy banks, but that's probably because they're afraid of change. Get it? Change? Anyways, the piggy bank also has a hat on it with the X-Men flag, so we're going to remember that banks are exempt from registration. Now, this particular piggy bank is also being held by this large building with hands, which is going to represent a company. Now, this company is just holding the bank, so it's a holding company. And it doesn't have an X-Men flag on it. In fact, it's painted with a no symbol on top of it. So holding companies are not exempt from the Investment Company Act of 1933, but the banks they hold are. Below that, we have the number 147. This is going to represent Rule 147. We're going to split up the number into a 1 and a 47. And we're going to place the 47 on a map of the continental United States. While the one that kind of looks like a building, in fact it is a building, it's going to be the Empire State Building again, which is the same image we use to represent a state. So the 1 represents just one state, and the 47 represents the other states. When this rule was created, there were only 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska came later. So what we have here is a state that is separate from the other continental United States. This is because under Rule 147, a company can raise funds without registering as long as it's an intrastate offering. An offering that is only offered in one state, intrastate. If you look closely at the Empire State Building, it's filled with a green liquid up to 80%. This is because in order to qualify for a Rule 147 exemption, the company has to derive at least 80% of its sales from that one state, and most employees have to work for that home state as well. So an offering that is done in only one state and not offered in any way to residents of the other states is exempt from registration under the SEC Act of 1933. Please also notice that I placed an X-Men flag on top of the Empire State Building so that you remember that intrastate offerings are exempt from registration under Rule 147. Our final image is that of Lady Diane, or Lady D. Now, Lady D is going to remind us of Reg D. Here she has 3 arms, and she's holding on to 3 briefcases, which have the numbers 504, 505, and 506. She also has this really neat hat with an X-Men flag on top of it. And by now you know what that means. And with that, we're done. thanks for listening. We really hope you got something from this video. If you liked it, leave a comment. We love hearing from you.